So today has been an interesting day around this place as we have continued to worship in this afterglow of Easter and the hope of what resurrection possibilities there exist among us. How many of you have had a great week this week after Easter? How many of you have lived into a week saying, it's possible? It's possible. Thank you. So some of you got the message last week. Yes. And so this week, our hope has been that we continue to live in light of the resurrection possibilities. And so at the last service, we had 5 people join the church again. And then we also, during the children's moment, we cut down a couple trees a couple months ago out by the sanctuary. And so we replanted a tree in honor of Earth Day this weekend. And so we planted a new koa tree outside the sanctuary. So on your way out, wave hi to koa tree. And you're going to be able to watch it grow forever, because it should last a long time. And our hope is that we're helping educate and inspire our kids that this thing called Earth is all of our home, and that we have a role to play in making sure that we take care of it, as well as it's the very first job in all of Scripture. Did you know that? The very first job that God gave to humanity was to take care of the garden. And luckily for us, we are a church in the garden, I believe is our nickname. So we have equally important role to play here. See that big jump from Genesis 1 to... Amazing, right? So in your little white thing in front of you that's on the ground is a prayer card. Take a moment, fill that out, and use it later by either giving it to Pastor Brandon or myself, or putting it in the baskets at the front later in the service. Right now we are in the basking glow of an empty tomb. And our hope is that we can talk about what is the possibilities of the resurrection that make a difference in my life and in the life of the community and the life of the cosmos. And so for these 3 weeks, we're going to look at today our lives personally, our life collectively, and then our world, the cosmos. And what difference does all this make in our lives? And so I wanted to start out with a passage of the Easter glow in Luke's Gospel. I think Brandon, I wasn't in here, but you didn't allude to it? So Brandon alluded to this in other services, so now you know what he alluded to. So there's this story called the Road to Emmaus, in which disciples are walking to a town that no one knows where it is, called Emmaus. And they're walking, and suddenly this guy shows up and starts chatting with them. And they invite them to a meal, and as they're sitting at the table, it says this: after he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were open, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. So again, I'm going to read it again. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. It was this moment of awakening. The resurrections happen. They're trying to make sense of what in the world is going on. And suddenly they're walking along with this fellow that knows exactly what's going on, and they don't recognize him until he breaks bread at the table, that suddenly they are awakened to what is happening already in front of them. And it goes on to say that they were like, whoa, how did we not know that was Jesus? We were with him and never saw him. So what they went through was what I call an awakening. Awakening are these moments in which God becomes real in a real sense in your life. For me, I remember one of my experiences of awakening. I was in Colorado, and I took a lift up to over 14,000 feet above the tree line to go skiing. And as I was sitting on the lift, looking at the panoramic view around the world, I realized the vastness of God and the smallness of me. And in that moment, there were no words that could express what I felt inside. It was this moment of awakening that something is greater than myself. And not just greater, but amazing, that this is just a small part of the great creation. And who am I sitting in the midst on a chairlift, observing the beauty of this world that's all around? In that moment, there was a warmth, an experience of God inside. And it launched me into trying to understand, what does this faith mean and what difference does it make? You see, our faith is about waking up. And God has used nature in a major way throughout the Scriptures and throughout humanity to speak about God's presence to us. It's called natural theology. Anybody heard of natural theology? Natural theology is literally a theology that you can sit in nature and learn everything you need to know about God. You can sit and observe a sunset, a rainbow, a storm cloud. You can sit and experience the fullness of God by being a part of the larger creation. And that's why a lot of people love living here, right? Because when do you not find yourself mesmerized with beauty here? It's all around us. And so natural theology teaches us that God is always speaking to us. We just need to become alert to or awake to what God is already doing. And so Paul says in Romans 1, when he's building a case for why God exists, he says this: ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen because they are understood through the things that God has made. You get that? That we can understand the vastness and the character of God by that which God has already created. It's a reflection of God's own heart into the world around us. And so later, Paul says in this letter to Ephesians, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." It's the Easter message. Awake. Awaken yourself to what God is already doing. The tomb is empty. God has overcome all things. And so today what I want to talk about was, what does that look like in our real lives? Whenever you have an awakening experience, most often it is wordless. And when you try to explain to people the awesome experience that you've had, you're like, there's just nothing I can grasp onto that can express what has happened inside me. I keep trying to get it, but there's not a word that can describe it. So we use words like awesome, or amazing, or wow, and yet it doesn't even touch the experience. And so we're invited into this huge world in which the language that we have pales in comparison to the experience that happens within. And so we're invited to awaken. In the church world, oftentimes the word used in churches is conversion. Has anybody heard that word? Conversion? I should be converted to Christianity, or I should be converted to Central Union Church. The word conversion, I think, actually has a really good deep meaning if you look at it with the lens of Jesus. The problem is that we've used it as a way to divide people and really missed the point of what I think Jesus was actually inviting us to. My story is one that I didn't really grow up in the church, and so as a young college student, I wandered into a church and came to faith, whatever that means, at that church. All I knew was that I was miserable and I needed some help, and I couldn't fix myself. And so they kept talking about, you need to be converted. You need to ask Jesus into your heart. You need to say this special prayer. And most often the special prayer was this ideology that if you don't say the prayer just right, you're going to burn in hell. But if you say it just right, that's the ticket to heaven. And suddenly as I got older and started maturing in faith, I started thinking, well, if God's always with me, then why do I need to ask him in my heart? Isn't God already there? And what does it mean if God is already resurrected from the dead and overcome all things? Why does God have favorites and only pick some of those and damn most of creation and humanity to hell? And suddenly I started reading these scriptures anew and started seeing stories of awakening that happen over and over again. And this call that God has overcome all things and reconciled the world to himself, Paul says in Romans. That God has already reckoned and reconciled the world to God's self. And we're invited to awaken to what already has happened. And because of that, these scriptures make a totally different storyline, especially in light of Jesus' own teaching. When you think about Jesus' teachings, how often do you see Jesus say convert? Never. Jesus wasn't a Christian, in case if you didn't know that. Jesus was Jewish. Never did Jesus walk around for 3 years saying, become Jewish, become Jewish, become Jewish, become Jewish. He said, the kingdom of God is at hand. You are sons and daughters of the Great One. Rejoice and receive. He never once asked us to convert. He asked us to wake up. And the problem with conversion that I've watched in my career as a minister is it is completely possible to convert people to Christianity and they never wake up. They learn all the right things to say in church. They know how they should dress. They know the things that they shouldn't do, or at least admit to. And so I lived in the Midwest for a season, and the joke was that you can always tell a Baptist at the liquor store because they don't look at anyone else. Because, right, in the Baptist tradition, at least in the Midwest, good Baptists don't drink alcohol. And so they'll never have it at anything at church. But, man, you leave church, and it's like, woo-hoo! But at church, we know how to act. And so we learn how to put on these masks and do the dance, and nothing ever changes inside. And so the church that I came to faith in, or awakened to God in, I remember in the front of the church, they had all these kneelers that went all the way around the front of the church. And every Sunday, the pastor would get up and do these really good sermons. At the end of it, he'd say, you know, we love you so much that we don't want you to rot in hell or burn in hell or experience hell or whatever the phrase he used. You need to come to the front and ask Jesus into your hearts. And I remember running up there over and over again going, how many times do I have to do this before it works? And one day someone told me it takes 8 times for someone to do it for it to stick. And I said, how do you figure that out? Like, how do you know whether or not someone's awake to God, and how do you know that it takes 8 times for them to do it for it to actually work? And then I started coming to understand these ancient languages, and that the word salvation in the New Testament is something that means daily, a continuation that continually happens. It's not I was once saved, it's that I'm continually being saved. That this idea of Christianity was much more about awakening and growing in the depth of faith so that we look a lot more like Jesus in our own lives. In that church, there were some amazing people, not to discount the church in any way. But I also noticed where there were just as many people that walked in and out of that church that were still just as greedy as when they walked in, just as mean-spirited, that still saw enemies as enemies and that we should take them out. That the reflection of Jesus of the Gospels was not reflected in the people. You see, they were converted to something, but it never changed them. It never awakened them. It never stirred them in such a way that they became profoundly different and functioning out of a different place. And so how does one awaken? Think about it for a minute in your own life. How have you awakened to God? The 3 ways that I thought of, and the list is not exhaustive or authoritative. One is that we awaken through awe. In moments when you stand in awe, you can't help but wake up to God. That is worship. That is the experience of God in our lives. And when we stand in awe, we'll never find words enough to describe what happens internally within us in the way that it changes us and inspires us. Paul says that everything that is revealed by the light is light. When we stand in the midst of God's light, we stand in the midst of this beauty that we could never imagine. And sometimes the phrases I hear is, that's always been here? Yes, it's always been here. Secondly, to awaken, you're going to love this one. To awaken, you have to sometimes go through adversity. No one ever signs up for adversity, but adversity is the greatest teacher in our lives. Adversity teaches us that we can't do it alone. Adversity opens the door of our operating systems, as Cynthia Bordeaux talks about. Our operating system doesn't work anymore. And so we need a better operating system to function out of, to get out of the adversity. And when we live through adversity and make it to the other side, we often stand going, wow, look at what God has done. It no longer is look at how strong I am or look how creative I am. It's, I didn't. And people look at you like you're crazy, except for those that have awakened. And they just smile and nod their head and say, I get it. I've been there. I've done it myself. Lastly, alertness. The amazing thing is, have you ever been somewhere and then see something differently when you've gotten there? It's always been there, but you just didn't see it. That's kind of like the spirits. It's always right here. We just don't always see it. And sometimes other people keep talking about it, and we're like, oh, what? Where'd you see that? But the reality is that we have to have an alertness to be able to see what God is already doing around us. To awaken is to see, and to see clearly what God is doing. Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. This awaking thing has a whole lot less to do with, did you say the right prayer to ask Jesus in your heart? I trust that God is more gracious than our prayers. I trust that God knows us better than we know ourselves. And I trust that the day that I take my last breath on this earth and stand with God, I'm going to be dumbfounded and say, really? Wow. I would imagine that God isn't so worried about the exactness of our prayers as He is with the openness of our souls. To become awake is to say, God, I'm here. Awaken me. Help me to see what is already around me. Help me to see you that is in me. And the phrase that was on the screen when you first came in today from Meister Eckhart says, the eye with which I see God is the same one with which God sees me. We become one. And so may you awaken in this resurrection possibility to see how God is stirring in your life and in your world. And as God stirs, what you realize is this waterfall of grace is large enough for everyone to stand under. Instead of creating us and them, we do what Jesus did and say, welcome to my table. All are welcomed here. All are welcomed at this meal, for none of you have earned it. But instead, you are welcomed as sons and daughters of God. And so today, we invite you to this table. And we welcome you because you are brothers and sisters on a journey, just like us. And because we're brothers and sisters on this journey, we know that we need to awaken, and we need each other along this journey too. And so we come and gather around table in this belief that God is here. And through these elements, nourishes us and blesses us and loves us.